It's a squirrely topic, but we're going to talk even more directly and pointedly about innovation and how to measure it, how specifically to value it. Our next guest believes that innovation is measurable, that the value of intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademarks, licenses, brands are very, very measurable, and that the value of those pieces of intellectual property not only provide a moat, but an asset for companies that should be able to be valued specifically. David Martin is the CEO of MCAM International, and he, along with CNBC, have come up with the IQ 100, which is a stock market index that is based not on market value, not on price like the Dow is, but rather on the value of intangible assets like intellectual property. And best of all, the IQ 100 has outperformed the other well-known indexes of performance over history and indeed so far this year. David Martin, again, the CEO of MCAM International, he's going to tell us about this index, how he values intellectual property. David, welcome to the stage. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Tyler. It is interesting to be here because in many respects, when I began the advocacy for innovation being part of how we measure value in enterprise in 1998, as a matter of fact, we are just a few days away from the birth of MCAM. It's 20 years old in a few days. And I recall having a meeting with then the FASB talking about whether we should eliminate pooling of interest accounting. Some of you would remember those fond discussions. And I was sitting next to the CFO and the CEO of one of the largest tech companies out of California, and I was told that if we eliminate pooling of interest accounting, the capital markets as we know them would cease to exist. And he decided to take that argument all the way up to a Senate Finance Committee hearing where he made that statement. It's kind of ironic that as I do the first year anniversary victory lap of the CNBC IQ 100 index, not only has the capital markets seemed to survive FASB 141 and 142, but somehow or another we seem to have seen growth happen, and we've seen growth happen around a very important piece of the way the economy works. And unfortunately, we don't, there we go. We don't, the screen is actually meant to be a bit of an homage to my mother. My mother is a classic linguist. She made sure we all knew Greek and Latin before we went to kindergarten. And so apologies in advance for what's on this slide, but it's important to understand that when we think of innovation, it's a blunt instrument. It's a very blunt tool to describe something. If we think about what innovation is, innovation can be a natural evolutionary process of how we move through industry cycles. It can also be very anticipatory, almost on the edge of premonition, where people start going, my God, how did you know that somebody would actually put a motor on the end of a whirling string and turn it into a weed eater? And we've heard time and time again, the best innovations are things where they appear to be absolutely self-evident after they exist. That premonition of everybody wanted a weed eater until the weed eater showed up. We didn't know we could get them. And then pretty soon we all had them. This idea of what innovation is as varied as the people having conversations. And because of that, in the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, the term innovation really lost its way. Innovation, in one sense, meant do we have the ability back then to compete with Japan? Because that was the dominant meme that we were talking about. And the answer, unfortunately, at the time, in 1980 and 1981, 1982, with people like Bruce Merrifield and others, was that we actually, as a country, had developed a mentality that says we are the innovators, but we didn't actually define what that meant. And in the case of 1981, when we had that giant shock that all of a sudden Japanese companies were starting to compete with us on new products and on new things, we sat there going, whoa, 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 that can't happen because we're America. We are the place where innovation happens. Very famously, in the mid-90s, one of the top topics that was discussed in the media and all kinds of outlets was, is America at risk from Asian countries? And the CEO response in interviews was, of course not. The rest of the world has informed and educated labor forces, but we're the ones that think. Well, fast forward to today. We now live in a world where, whether it's chemistry or whether it's product development or whether it's technology or anything else, we actually live in a world where the globe is actually all competing. And they're all competing for the same level of influence. And so all of those moments lead us to an interesting question, which is, what is innovation? And then secondarily, how do we measure it? With the team at CNBC last year, when we launched the IQ 100 index, we actually set out to do something very interesting. In the 124 years of major indices, and that starts with the Dow back in the 1800s, which really, in many respects, was addressing a very fundamental human need. When the Dow was set up, the reason why the Dow really was successful is that people love numbers. But they loved numbers because they loved betting. And the reason why, if you published a number every day, people would buy the newspaper that published the number every day, ergo Wall Street Journal. The reason why that made sense was it actually made sense. People like to have that sense of what's happening tomorrow and what's happening the next day. And we realized that over time, the Dow Industrials served a need to actually start saying we can measure something about the economy. But as time went on, as the markets evolved, as industrial companies started getting more globally relevant, the question became, well, aren't there better ways to do it? And so what we brought was other blunt instruments. We brought financial markets, we brought cap-weighted indices, we brought all kinds of other things together, but we were still obsessed with counting. And here's the crux of the innovation index paradox. The paradox was everything we count is in the rearview mirror. How did we do last quarter? How did we do last year? What's the year-to-year comparison? These are rearview mirror indices. And so no matter what index you look at, the problem is every index was informed by what has happened. And CNBC said, well, why don't we see what happens if we look through the windshield? What if we actually look in front? What if we try to understand what companies are positioning themselves to do rather than how well they performed in the background? The innovation of the IQ 100 index is very simply described in two very simple graphics. And I'll take two of the components to just introduce you to the notion of what the innovation index is first. If you think of component DXC, which, as most of you know, is the union of CSC, HP Enterprise, and a bunch of other bits and pieces that have been brought together and rebranded DXC, what you'll see is a company that actually looks to anticipate where its service level agreements with all of its relationships needs to focus. So DXC looks at innovation as a responsive, almost reflexive opportunity set. The externalities define where DXC is going. And like many other businesses, DXC's success, and which they, by the way, have had a lot of success, DXC's success is based on an innovation model that says, let's look at the service ecosystem that we work in, and let's listen. Let's listen. The voice of the customer in DXC's world is a voice that says, here are the challenges we're up against. Here are the new threats we're up against. We're going to hear about cyber shortly. We're going to hear about, from the Secretary of Commerce, we're going to hear about some of the things that are happening at the federal level around innovation. What is the thing that keeps people up at night, and how do I respond to it? And the reason why DXC has been successful in both identifying and deploying their innovation is because they're listening to the voice of their customer, but not the voice of here's the last 5%, 2%, 1% solution to an existing inefficiency. They're listening for what is the thing that keeps you up at night. And then they're going back and saying, how do we develop solutions that actually address our core industry focus? That's a responsive innovation. That's actually listening. That's not premonition. That's not crystal balls. That's actually looking at critical mass of common problems and saying, how do we respond in that world to that critical mass issue? And that's one form of innovation. Another one is the more spaghetti chart behind you right now. Grace, 3M, and Kimberly-Clark. If I had asked before this presentation for you to put a top 10 list of the most innovative companies up, I doubt most of you would have put any of them up. I'm going to argue why they are all very relevant, not only components of the index, but exceptionally well-positioned companies for the future. Let's start in the middle of the slide. 3M has always been the Post-it note anecdote for all times, right? The accidental, sticky stuff that didn't do what it was made to do, but actually did something else, right? And unfortunately, while the anecdote about the Post-it note is interesting, it has actually robbed 3M of its real genius, because 3M has done a lot more than just Post-it notes. It, in fact, has been very sensitive to the fact that they've seen themselves almost the way the BASF commercial used to run. You guys remember the old BASF commercial? We don't make the things that you buy, we make them better. So it was, we don't make the plastic, we make it harder. We don't make the paint, we make it brighter. Well, 3M has been that, but not that in one or two industries. 3M has been that responsive to an enormous number of industries. And if you look at 3M's patent filing specifically, it's very fascinating to realize that unlike certain companies, and I won't address any company by name simply because I do not have the attendee list here, so I'm going to be really careful about this. Some companies think of innovation as trying to defend the race to the commodity bottom of price. So their innovation is about defending some version of the downward slide of price. And if I have a whole stack of patents, I'm going to at least be able to prop up a price for a period of time. Other companies actually think about what they've seen in the industry and start modeling or adapting or adopting different strategies around those things. And 3M is a case study in excellence. Because what 3M does when it looks at how it does innovation, it specifically says, here's the state of the art. And it acknowledges what its competitors are doing. It acknowledges what's happening in the marketplace. And then it says, this is the qualitative way we can address that problem and move something forward. And when you look at the names on this slide, it's actually somewhat mind-blowing. 3M's Field Effect goes from crazy places like International Paper or Weyerhaeuser, where you'd kind of sit there going, well, I would never put them in the same GICS code or the SIC code or anything else. I wouldn't put them in the same place. But if you look at where their marginal profitability comes from, it turns out that they're taking marginal profit from those companies. But they're also taking marginal profit from other companies, because what they've seen is places inside of supply chains where they can make a difference. The innovation company that wins, the innovation company that is on the IQ 100 index, is a company that not only has been responsive to its top-line product, the thing that people associate the company with, but they've also looked at supply chains and said, where are there inefficiencies in other supply chains that I can address with something that is potentially even non-core to who I am and what I'm about? And most of them, if you look at where the marginal profitability of business is coming from, are actually opening up the gap away from commodity influences of their stock price and their actual revenues and earnings. They're opening up that gap by playing into lateral markets. They've identified other people's inefficiencies and said, we can solve those. I would argue that in 5 years, with index investing where it is, with passive indexing happening the way it is, with ETFs proliferating the way they are, it is highly likely that we will be smart enough as a human species to get rid of classifications on companies. The reason is because at any point in time, that classifier may entirely place you in the wrong market. What is 3M? Well, is 3M more Grace or Exxon, or is it more Kimberly-Clark and Colgate-Palmolive? And the question is answered not based on a classifier, but it's based on market dynamics. Where are the solutions addressing real-world inefficiencies, real-world market opportunities? Now, Procter & Gamble is an interesting little variant in that. And the reason why I throw P&G in there, also an industry component in the index and also a very important part of the innovation picture, is Procter & Gamble does a very interesting thing. They expropriate creativity very well. And that's a very polite way of saying something I could say less politely. But they do it very well. What do? They actually look at where the market is, they look at where other people are responding, and what they look for is white space that others aren't exploiting. Rather than simply looking at the inertia of what they've always been, they're asking themselves the question, do we need to redefine who we are based on where we see others going? Corporate intelligence, very important. Foresight, very important. All of these things come together to say it's not just about the smart guys you have in your lab and the smart relationships you have with that professor who's doing very interesting work in the lab somewhere else. It's about, are you anticipating where you need to go and how you need to redefine yourself based on what is happening out in the marketplace. Procter & Gamble's a case example of how to do that. They are a best practices model in that space. Now, does it matter? Well, the good news is, as we said, this is the one-year anniversary of the IQ 100. We launched it 1 year ago today. And the great news is we're 600 basis points over the S&P. Now, in the S&P, we would argue this year particularly, this has been a pretty good year for equities. I've sat across the table from financial managers and RIAs and hedge fund managers. I've sat across the table from the world's best investors, and they've told me you can't find alpha in large cap equities in the US. Here's the bad news. We can. You all are helping us do that. And as members, many of you, and some of you aspiring members to the IQ 100 index, as the world's first quantitative index that actually is measuring what the forward view of companies are, rather than a rearward-looking historical, financials, cap-weighted, otherwise index, we see an opportunity for us and for all of you to actually redefine what innovation is, where innovation now becomes the single largest driver of how you avoid the commodity effects of what's happening in the marketplace. It's a great day to celebrate. We're very pleased with the CNBC team for actually helping get this off the ground, and we're looking forward to seeing many of you in the future either stay on, rise, or be replaced. It's all going to turn on how you define innovation in your institutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much.